"Help, please, human, my mom is trapped in a rock trap," begged the alien girl the sun had long set over the barren red planet, HFY, casting an eerie glow on the jagged landscape. Captain Ethan Voss stood at the edge of a cliff, staring out into the distance. The mining operation was going well, but there was something unsettling about this planet. Despite the beauty of the alien world, the team had been working for weeks without a break, and tensions were starting to rise. Ethan was a man of few words, but when he spoke, his crew listened. His team, a mix of experienced miners and engineers, trusted him to lead them safely through the dangerous terrain of HFY. They had been sent to extract valuable minerals, but every day seemed to bring a new challenge, from unstable ground to violent dust storms. Today, the team had been surveying a canyon deep within the planet's red rock formations. They had located a rich vein of minerals, but they hadn't expected what would happen next. The radio crackled to life with an urgent voice, sharp and trembling with fear. "Help, please, human," the voice gasped. Ethan's hand instinctively moved to the communication panel. It was a female voice, but it wasn't human. "Who is this?" Ethan asked, his voice steady, though his heart began to race. "My name is Kara. My mother is trapped in a rock trap," the voice pleaded. "Please, you have to help." Ethan's brow furrowed as he processed the information. Rock trap, it sounded like a local disaster, something that could happen on this unpredictable planet. But the desperation in the alien girl's voice was unmistakable. "Where are you?" Ethan asked, already turning to his team. The situation was serious, and the last thing they needed was more danger, but this wasn't just any distress call, it was a plea for help. And if there was one thing humans did best, it was answering the call when others needed them. "I'm in the canyon near the eastern ridge. Please hurry, my mom. She's under a pile of rocks. I don't know how much time she has left." Ethan quickly motioned to his crew, who had been busy preparing mining equipment. "Pack up, we're going on a rescue mission." The crew moved quickly, pulling together their gear and rushing toward the transport vehicle. Kara's coordinates were only a few kilometers away, but it would take them almost an hour to reach her. In the meantime, Ethan couldn't stop thinking about the girl's words. Her mother trapped under a pile of rocks. How had it happened? Was this some kind of natural disaster? And why was she calling humans for help? The HFY inhabitants, the Zyrixians, were a highly advanced species, far more advanced in some ways than humans. So why would they need help from the very species they had considered inferior? The transport vehicle hummed to life as the crew climbed in, and the team set off, crossing the rocky landscape at high speed. The red dust kicked up behind them as they raced through the harsh terrain, the canyon looming in the distance. As they approached the eastern ridge, the radio crackled again. Kara's voice was clearer now, though still filled with panic. "You're getting close. Please hurry." "I don't think she can hold on much longer." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. This was more than just a rescue mission. Something wasn't adding up, but that would have to wait. They were getting closer, and time was running out. When they arrived at the canyon's edge, Ethan led the crew on foot. The canyon stretched out before them, a deep crevice filled with loose rocks and the remnants of collapsed stone. It was a dangerous place, the ground unstable and prone to shifting. But the team was used to danger. They had been on enough missions to know how to navigate these types of conditions. Kara's voice came through the radio again, clearer now but still strained. "I'm near the entrance at the base of the canyon. You'll see it. There's a big boulder blocking the way." Ethan's team made their way down the narrow path, carefully stepping over fallen rocks and avoiding unstable ground. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of metal and earth hung heavy in the air. As they reached the bottom of the canyon, they saw Kara standing there, waiting anxiously. She was a young Zyrixian girl, her skin a pale green hue, with long, silver hair that shimmered in the dim light. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her trembling hands clutched a small communication device. When she saw them, her face softened with relief. "You came," she whispered, her voice cracking. Ethan knelt down to her level, offering a reassuring smile. "We're here, Kara." "Where's your mother?" She pointed to a large rock formation ahead. "She's under there. I don't know how long she's been trapped, but I'm scared. Please, she's all I have." Ethan's heart went out to the girl. He had seen his own crew members lose loved ones on difficult missions, and the thought of someone losing their mother in such a harsh way weighed heavily on him. But he couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment. They had a job to do, and the clock was ticking. "All right," he said firmly, turning to his crew. We need to clear the area around that boulder. Let's move. The team quickly set to work, using their mining tools to carefully assess the rock formation. They weren't equipped for a rescue operation like this, but they had enough training to know how to handle a collapse like this. They had to be careful. One wrong move and the whole canyon could shift, trapping everyone inside. Ethan worked with a sense of urgency, his mind focused on the task at hand. His team followed his lead, their movements precise and deliberate. Kara watched them with a mixture of awe and gratitude. To her, these humans were nothing like the other species she had encountered. They were strong, resourceful, and unafraid to help when it mattered most. Hours passed and the work was exhausting. The crew had made some progress, but they weren't there yet. The pressure was building. Kara's mother, Sarah, was still trapped and time was running out. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow over the canyon, Ethan's voice rang out. "Hold up, we're close now, just a few more minutes." Kara's eyes locked on him, her expression filled with both hope and fear. "Please help her, please save her." Ethan nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "We will." The team pushed forward with renewed determination, their efforts focused on freeing Sarah from the rock trap. As the minutes stretched into hours, they all understood one thing. Humans might not be the strongest, the smartest, or the most advanced, but they had something that could never be measured: heart. The sun had long disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the canyon bathed in the dim glow of the artificial lights the human team had set up. The air was growing colder, and every movement sent small rocks skittering down the steep cliffs. Ethan stood, surveying the scene, his mind calculating their next move. His crew worked steadily, using their mining tools to slowly chip away at the rock pile blocking the path to Sarah, Kara's trapped mother. Kara stood to the side, her gaze fixed on the large boulder. She had barely moved since they arrived, her hands gripping the communicator tightly, as if it was the only thing holding her together. Ethan could see the fear in her eyes, and he could feel the weight of her desperation pressing down on him. They were making progress, but it wasn't fast enough. Every minute that passed brought her mother closer to death. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his thoughts momentarily drifting to his own family back home on Earth. He didn't know why it felt so important to help this alien girl. Maybe it was the way she had called out to him, the raw fear in her voice that reminded him of his own loved ones. Maybe it was the helplessness he saw in her face. Or maybe it was simply the human instinct to act when others needed help. Whatever the reason, he wasn't about to leave this alien world without doing everything in his power to save her mother. He turned back to his crew. "We need to speed this up. Everyone, focus." The team didn't need to be told twice. They picked up the pace, their movements synchronized as they used their equipment to carefully remove the rocks and debris. The sound of metal scraping against stone filled the air, echoing off the canyon walls. Kara took a step forward, her voice trembling. "Will you be able to get her out in time?" Ethan didn't want to lie to her. He didn't have the answers she wanted, but he couldn't afford to show doubt. Not now. "We're doing everything we can," he said, his voice steady but firm. "You have my word, we won't stop until she's free." Kara nodded, her eyes brimming with tears, but she didn't say anything else. Ethan couldn't blame her. What words could comfort someone in her position? Her mother, the only family she had left, was trapped under tons of rock, and the clock was ticking. Ethan's thoughts kept turning back to the girl's story. The Zyrixians were a proud race. They were known for their intelligence and their advanced technology, but they were not invincible. Ethan had learned this over the weeks of working with them. Despite their technological prowess, they were still vulnerable to the unpredictability of their planet. Earth's weather was nothing compared to HFY violent storms, sudden tremors, and unstable terrain. For all their technological advances, the Zyrixians were at the mercy of the land they called home. Kara had told him earlier that her mother was an important figure in their society. She was a scientist, an innovator, and a key leader among the Zyrixians. Losing her would not only destroy Kara's world, but also set their people back by years. Ethan now understood why the girl had been so desperate. She wasn't just asking for help. She was begging for a chance to save everything she knew. With a grunt, one of the miners, Jacob, slammed a crowbar into the rock, making a small crack appear. He quickly used his tool to widen it, but the rock was stubborn. The tremors from earlier had made it more difficult to move. It felt as if the entire canyon was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. How much longer? Kara asked, her voice soft, like she was afraid of the answer. Ethan hesitated for just a moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the rock pile. He could feel the weight of time pressing against him, each passing second stretching out longer than the last. "We'll have her out soon, I promise," he said, his voice quieter than before. The truth was, he didn't know how much longer they had. The longer they waited, the greater the risk of the rocks shifting and burying them all. The rock formations in this part of the canyon were unstable, and they had already lost too much time to the shifting ground. Every moment they spent here was a gamble. "I can't wait any longer." "We need to move faster." Jacob's voice cut through the silence, and Ethan turned to see his crew members' frustration. His hands were covered in dust and his face was streaked with sweat. But it wasn't anger that pushed Jacob, it was fear. Fear for their safety and, more importantly, fear for the life of someone they'd just met. Ethan took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "I know, but if we rush now, we might make things worse. We're not here to cause more harm. We have to be precise." Kara was listening closely, her eyes moving from one member of the team to the next. She had already seen their determination, but the uncertainty in the air was a reminder of how fragile hope could be in a situation like this. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a large section of rock cracked open. The team collectively paused, watching as the last layer of rock slid off the pile. There, under the remaining rubble, they saw the outline of a figure. It was a Zyrixian woman, Sarah. She was unconscious, but she was alive. The crew could hear her faint breathing, shallow but steady. She was still trapped, though, her body wedged between several heavy rocks. Is she alive?" Kara whispered, stepping closer, her voice barely audible. Ethan nodded, but his expression remained grim. "She's alive, but we need to get her out now." The team quickly mobilized again, using their tools to carefully lift the rocks off of Sarah. It wasn't easy. The rocks were heavy and the space was cramped. Every time they moved one, they had to be cautious, making sure not to cause another collapse. It felt like each step they took toward freeing her could be their last. Minutes passed, and Ethan's muscles ached with the effort. Sweat trickled down his face, stinging his eyes, but he ignored it. His focus was solely on Sarah and Kara. Finally, with a final effort, they cleared the last of the debris. The crew quickly moved to lift Sarah from the rocks, their movements precise and swift. Kara rushed forward to her mother's side, her hands trembling as she touched her face. "She's breathing, but she's in bad shape," Jacob said, stepping back to give Kara space. Kara looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and worry. "You saved her, you really saved her." Ethan nodded, but he didn't allow himself to feel relief just yet. They had done what they came to do, but the danger wasn't over. The rocks were still unstable, and they needed to get out of the canyon before the next tremor hit. "We have to move fast," he said, his voice steady. "We're not safe here yet. Get ready to go." Kara didn't argue. She moved quickly to help her mother, gently cradling her head in her lap. "We're going to get out of here, Mom. Hold on." The human team readied themselves for the long trek back up the canyon. They had managed to save Sarah, but the real challenge was getting them all out safely. The canyon was treacherous, and they couldn't afford to be caught in another collapse. As they began to move, the ground beneath their feet shifted again, but this time it wasn't as violent. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. Every step they took felt like it could be their last. But with the strength of the humans and the hope that Kara had given them, they made their way up the canyon. The rescue wasn't over yet, but they had made it this far. And that was all that mattered. The path back up the canyon was much harder than the way down. The air was thick with dust, and the rocks beneath their feet felt more unstable than ever. Every time they took a step, the ground seemed to shift beneath them, as if the canyon itself was trying to swallow them whole. Ethan led the way, keeping his eyes on the rocky terrain, his thoughts constantly racing. Kara was behind him, her mother carefully cradled in her arms. Sarah's condition had not improved. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow and her pulse weak. The human crew had given her what little medical supplies they had, but there was no time to wait for a proper medical team. Every minute they spent in the canyon increased the risk of another rock slide or worse, a complete collapse of the canyon walls. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He understood the danger, and the pressure weighed heavily on him. He had made a promise to Kara, and he couldn't afford to break it. They had to get out of the canyon, but the rocks were treacherous, and the weather was getting worse. The wind began to pick up as they moved up the canyon. The sky above darkened, clouds swirling together to form a heavy storm. The violent winds whipped at their faces, and the dust was blinding. Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had seen enough storms on this planet to know that this one was going to be bad. The temperature began to drop quickly, and the ground beneath their feet felt even more unstable. It was becoming a race against time, but Ethan couldn't help feeling a pang of guilt. They hadn't even reached the top yet, and he wasn't sure how much longer the team could keep going. Sarah's condition wasn't improving, and Kara was becoming increasingly anxious. Kara's voice broke through his thoughts. Is she going to be okay? Ethan glanced over his shoulder, meeting her eyes for a brief moment. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and sweat, but her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She was holding her mother tightly, trying to keep her warm, though it was becoming clear that they couldn't afford to stay in one place for long. "We're doing everything we can," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "We're almost there, just a little further." The words didn't seem to comfort Kara. She nodded but didn't say anything else. Ethan could tell she was holding on by a thread. The fear in her eyes was the same fear he'd seen in the eyes of his crew when they faced impossible odds. The fear that comes with knowing that no matter how hard you try, sometimes you can't control the outcome. Ethan pushed forward, his feet crunching on the loose rocks as he moved quickly up the canyon wall. His team followed closely behind, each of them keeping their eyes on the path ahead. The storm was intensifying, and they had no choice but to keep moving. Kara's mother, Sarah, was starting to stir, her fingers twitching against Kara's chest. It was a small sign of life, but it was enough to make Kara's face brighten with hope. "She's waking up," Kara said, her voice trembling with relief. "Mom, can you hear me?" Sarah's eyelids fluttered open, and her gaze was unfocused, her pupils dilated. She looked up at Kara, then at Ethan, as if unsure of where she was. Her lips parted, and she tried to speak, but only a faint, hoarse whisper escaped her throat. "Kara, where am I?" "You're safe, Mom. You're with the humans. You're going to be all right." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she realized where she was and who was helping her. Her gaze flickered to Ethan, and though her voice was weak, there was gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you for saving me," Ethan nodded. "We're just doing what anyone would do. But we still need to get out of here." The wind howled again, louder this time, as if the storm itself was trying to warn them. Ethan felt the hairs on his neck stand up, and he glanced over his shoulder. The sky had grown darker, and the clouds were swirling in a way that made him uneasy. He had seen enough storms to know that this one wasn't just a typical HFY dust storm. This was something far worse. "We need to move faster," Ethan said urgently. "The storm's getting worse. We don't want to get caught out here." The team quickened their pace, the urgency in Ethan's voice pushing them forward. They were nearing the top of the canyon, but the storm was relentless. The wind howled in their ears, and the dust was so thick now that they could barely see more than a few feet ahead of them. Kara clutched her mother tighter, trying to shield her from the storm's fury. She was struggling to keep her balance in the shifting, rocky terrain, but the fear that had kept her moving earlier was starting to fade. She could feel her strength slipping away as the storm battered them from all sides. The group pressed on, fighting against the wind, but every step felt like it was costing them more. The storm was making it harder to hear one another, and the path was becoming more treacherous by the second. Ethan's thoughts raced as he calculated their options. There was no safe place to hide in this canyon. Their only chance was to get out of it as quickly as possible. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the air, followed by the sound of rocks shifting and crumbling. The canyon seemed to shake beneath their feet. "Move," Ethan shouted, grabbing Kara by the arm and pulling her toward the nearest stable ledge. "Now, everyone get to higher ground." The ground trembled beneath them, and before they could take another step, the entire side of the canyon wall gave way. Rocks rained down, falling in a cascade of destruction. Ethan's heart pounded as he pushed Kara and Sarah out of the way, taking cover behind a larger boulder. "Is everyone okay?" he called out, his voice barely audible above the deafening roar of the storm. "We're fine," came the response from one of the miners. "But the path's blocked. We can't go that way anymore." Ethan's mind raced. They had just been seconds away from safety, but now the storm and the rock slide had trapped them in the canyon once more. They were running out of time, and there was no guarantee they'd make it out alive. "Kara," Ethan said, turning to the young alien girl, "listen to me. We need to get out of here before the storm buries us." Your mom can't survive another collapse. Kara nodded, her face pale, but determination had returned to her eyes. She wasn't going to give up. Not now, not after everything they had been through. Ethan turned back to his team. We're going to have to find another way, keep moving and stay together. The team pushed forward, carefully navigating around the debris that had blocked their path. The storm was still raging and the wind had picked up, making it harder to hear one another. But they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. Minutes later, they found themselves standing at the edge of the canyon, looking out at the desolate landscape. They had made it this far, but the journey was far from over. The storm was still howling in the distance, but they had no choice. They had to keep moving. Kara's voice, hoarse but full of resolve, broke through the storm's fury. "We can make it," she said softly. "We can make it out of here." Ethan looked at her, then at the rest of the team. He nodded, his resolve hardening. They had no choice. They had to keep moving forward, no matter what. They had already come too far to stop now. The storm had become unbearable, its fury tearing through the canyon with a force that seemed almost unnatural. The wind howled like a beast, kicking up clouds of dust and debris that stung their eyes and made it hard to breathe. The once pristine red skies were now a swirling mass of dark clouds, and the ground beneath their feet felt as though it could collapse at any moment. Ethan gritted his teeth as he pressed on, his eyes squinting against the dust. His thoughts were focused, sharp. They had no choice but to keep moving forward, but each step felt like it was taking them further away from safety. They needed to get to higher ground, but the path was treacherous, and every time they made progress, the storm seemed to fight back harder. Kara's grip on her mother tightened as they struggled to move through the canyon. Sarah, though still unconscious, was beginning to stir again. Her breathing was a little steadier now, but the worry lines on her face were still visible. It was clear to Ethan that she was weak, and though she had survived the initial collapse, the storm was putting them all at greater risk. "Kara," Ethan said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "We need to get to shelter. There's a ridge up ahead. It might offer some cover." Kara looked up at him, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear, but she nodded. I understand. Just please don't let anything happen to her." Ethan wanted to promise her that nothing would happen, but he couldn't. The situation was too dangerous, and they were running out of time. Every moment spent in the canyon increased the chances that another collapse could trap them, or worse, bury them alive. He gave a quick, reassuring nod, but inside, his mind raced with the grim reality that they were barely holding on. The team pressed on, moving quickly despite the growing dangers. The rocks beneath their feet were slick with rain now, making the trek even harder. The storm was coming down in full force, and the wind was so strong that it nearly knocked them off their feet. Ethan kept a hand on his communicator, his other arm steadying Kara as they moved, but he could feel the urgency of the moment. They reached the ridge after what felt like hours of struggling against the storm, and the first thing they saw was the narrow entrance to a small, cave-like structure. It wasn't much, but it was their only hope of surviving the worst of the storm. "This way," Ethan called out, leading the group toward the shelter. The rocks shifted underfoot, but they made it into the cave just as another deafening gust of wind slammed into the canyon walls. Inside the cave, the wind was reduced to a dull roar, and the dust settled enough to allow them to catch their breath. The cave's entrance was small, and though it wasn't fully sheltered from the storm, it was far safer than staying exposed in the open. Ethan quickly turned to check on the group. The miners were all inside now, shaking off the dust and rain, but the look on their faces was one of weariness. They were exhausted, and the storm showed no signs of letting up, but for the moment they were safe. Kara sat down beside her mother, gently placing Sarah's head on a rock. She looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with fear and hope. "Is she going to be okay?" Ethan knelt beside her, checking Sarah's pulse again. The weak thrum under his fingers was a small but important sign of life. He was no medical expert, but he knew that they couldn't afford to wait much longer. Her body was under strain from the rocks, and the exposure to the storm wasn't helping. "We'll need to move her to better shelter once the storm passes," Ethan said, his voice low. "But for now, we have to stay put. I'll keep an eye on her." Kara nodded, her face pale but determined. She was doing her best to stay strong, but it was clear to Ethan that she was hanging on by a thread. She had been through so much already, and now, in this cave, surrounded by the storm, she was desperately trying to hold onto the last bit of hope that her mother would make it through. Ethan glanced back at the rest of the team. Everyone, set up a perimeter. We need to stay alert. This storm could last for hours, and we can't let our guard down. The crew nodded, each one of them pulling out tools and gear to fortify the shelter. It wasn't much, but the cave provided some protection from the worst of the storm. They worked quickly, securing themselves inside as best as they could, knowing that the worst wasn't over yet. As the storm raged on outside, Ethan couldn't help but think about how strange this situation had become. The Zyrixians, with their advanced technology, had been unable to prevent the disaster that had trapped Sarah. But here were humans, fighting against nature with nothing more than their wits, their tools, and their determination. It was a humbling thought, but it also filled Ethan with pride. Humans were capable of surviving, of adapting, no matter what the universe threw their way. Kara's voice broke through his thoughts. "Do you think we'll make it out of here?" Ethan turned to look at her. The fear in her eyes was still there, but there was something else now, something that hadn't been there before, a sense of determination. "We will," Ethan said firmly. "We're not done yet, you're not done yet." Kara didn't say anything, but she gave a small nod, as if trying to convince herself that what he said was true. The minutes stretched on, turning into hours. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up. Inside the cave, it was quiet except for the occasional rumbles of the wind outside. The team had gathered together, huddled for warmth, but their thoughts were all on Sarah and Kara. Ethan knew that they couldn't stay in the cave forever. They had to get Sarah to medical help as soon as possible. The longer they stayed trapped, the harder it would be for her to survive. But every time he thought about the path ahead, the storm, the unstable rocks, and the distant ridges that separated them from safety, he felt a pang of doubt. They had made it this far, but the future was still uncertain. The storm was relentless, but Ethan refused to let it defeat them. He looked over at Kara, who was still sitting beside her mother, holding her hand. He had seen that look in her eyes before, the one that told him she wasn't going to give up. She was strong even when it seemed like the world was against her, and that strength was something that Ethan could admire. They all had a role to play in this rescue. It wasn't just about strength or skill, it was about perseverance, it was about humanity. Ethan stood up, stretching his stiff limbs. He approached the miners who were sitting against the cave wall, taking a brief moment to rest. "We'll wait here until the storm clears, then we'll move out," he said. "But we need to stay sharp. We've come too far to fail now." The miners nodded, their faces set with determination. They weren't going to let the storm stop them, and neither was Ethan. The hours passed, and the storm's fury began to wane, but the group stayed in the cave for the night. The storm may have subsided, but the real challenge was just beginning. The storm finally began to settle, though the air was thick with the smell of rain and wet earth. The winds had died down to a steady hum, and the sky, once filled with dark clouds, was now a dull gray. It was still far from safe, but the worst of the storm was over. The question now was whether they could make it to safety before another disaster struck. Inside the cave, the group had been resting for several hours. Ethan kept a close eye on the team, ensuring that everyone was ready to move at a moment's notice. Kara had not left her mother's side, and Sarah, though still unconscious, seemed to be showing some signs of improvement. Her breathing had become steadier, though faint, and her skin was no longer as cold to the touch. Ethan stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the storm's remnants fade into the distance. The landscape ahead of them was still treacherous, but the narrow path leading up to the higher ridges was their best chance of escape. The longer they stayed in the cave, the more dangerous it became. The rocks surrounding them were unstable, and they didn't have much time before another collapse could trap them again. They had to get out. "We move now," Ethan said, turning back toward the group. His voice was calm but firm. "Everyone grab your gear, we're heading out." The miners were quick to rise, grabbing their tools and supplies. Kara stood up, her movements slow but determined. She reached down and gently lifted her mother, who was still weak but responding to the warmth of her daughter's touch. Ethan watched them for a moment, his heart heavy with the knowledge that their journey was far from over. Kara didn't say anything, but Ethan could see the worry etched on her face. She was trying to remain strong, but it was clear that her strength was beginning to fade. She had held on through the worst of the storm, but she couldn't keep carrying her mother forever. They needed to find proper shelter, and soon. "Can you make it, Kara?" Ethan asked gently, walking over to her. Kara gave a small nod, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion she was feeling. I can carry her, just lead the way. Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, though he knew the path ahead would not be easy. We'll all stay close, we're in this together. The team gathered at the cave's entrance, stepping out into the cool, damp air. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the earth beneath them was slick with mud. The canyon, once a place of oppressive silence, now seemed alive with the sounds of water trickling down the rocks and the distant rumblings of thunder. But it was still a dangerous place, and the sooner they moved, the better. Ethan led the way, carefully picking his steps along the wet rocks. The higher ridges loomed ahead, their peaks obscured by clouds, but they had no choice but to move toward them. The only other option was to stay in the canyon, where the risk of another collapse would only increase as the storm's aftereffects lingered. As they climbed higher, the wind picked up again, though not as violently as before. The terrain was uneven, and every step they took had to be calculated. The rain made the rocks slippery, and at times it felt like they were fighting against nature itself. But the team pressed on, one foot in front of the other, driven by the need to survive. Kara's pace was slow but steady. She was determined, but every few minutes she would glance at her mother, her worry visible. Sarah had not regained full consciousness, and Kara's concern was growing. Her mother had to be stabilized before they could take her to medical help. Ethan glanced over his shoulder. "How's she doing?" Kara didn't answer immediately. She looked down at her mother, her face softening for a moment. "She's still weak, but she's holding on." "Good," Ethan replied, though he wasn't sure if that was enough. The truth was, they didn't know how long Sarah had been trapped under the rocks before they'd found her. Even with the medical supplies they had, the injuries from the rockfall were still a mystery. They had to get to safety, soon. The path grew steeper as they made their way toward the higher ground. The wet rocks beneath their feet made it difficult to keep their footing, but the group moved with a sense of purpose. Ethan kept checking in with each member of the crew, making sure no one was left behind. The team was weary, but their resolve had not broken. Minutes passed, and the ridge was finally in sight. The ascent had been challenging, but they were nearly there. However, just as they thought they might be able to breathe a sigh of relief, the ground beneath them shifted. A loud crack echoed through the canyon, followed by a deep rumble. The rocks trembled, and the air was filled with the sound of shifting earth. "Move, move now!" Ethan shouted, urgency flooding his voice. The group quickened their pace, but the ground was growing increasingly unstable. Kara stumbled as the rocks shifted beneath her feet, but Ethan was there to catch her. "We're so close," he said, his voice low but firm. "Just a little further, stay with me." The team pressed forward, pushing themselves harder as the rocks continued to tremble. The canyon walls seemed to close in around them, but they had no choice but to keep moving. At last, they reached the top of the ridge. From there, they could see the valley below where their transport ship was waiting. The sight of it was enough to fill them with hope. They had made it. They were almost out of danger. But just as they began to move toward the ship, the ground shook once more, this time with greater force. A low rumble echoed through the valley, and Ethan's heart sank as he saw the rocks above them begin to shift. "Run!" he shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. "Get to the ship, now!" The team bolted, scrambling across the uneven ground as the rocks began to fall. Ethan glanced back, his eyes wide with fear as the canyon walls started to collapse in on themselves. Kara's breath was ragged as she ran, still carrying her mother in her arms. Ethan didn't look back again. They had to make it. There was no time for anything else. They reached the transport ship just as the final wave of rocks came crashing down. The ship's engines roared to life, and the crew scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut behind them. Ethan collapsed into the pilot's seat, his hands shaking as he powered up the ship. He glanced over at Kara, who was holding her mother tightly. Sarah was still unconscious, but at least she was alive. "We made it," Kara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan gave a weary smile. "We did." As the ship lifted off the ground, the last of the canyon collapsed in a cloud of dust and debris. The storm had passed, and the team had survived. They had faced the worst, but they were still alive. And that, in the end, was enough. The ship soared into the sky, leaving the broken landscape of HFY 4 behind. Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhausted but relieved. Kara looked out the window at the planet below, her face softened with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. She had lost so much, but she had gained something too. The knowledge that even in the darkest of moments, humans would do whatever it took to help those in need. They had come together, not just as humans or aliens, but as survivors. And that bond was something that could never be broken.